welcome to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. My name is Travis Jameson, and I'm your host. I serve as a pastor at Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church in Palo Alto, California. On today's episode, we are joined by Chuck DeGroat. Chuck wears many hats in the world of Christian counseling and spiritual care. Chuck serves as the professor of counseling and Christian spirituality and executive director of the clinical mental health counseling program at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. He's also a faculty member at the Soul Care Institute. Chuck is a licensed therapist, spiritual director, author of 5 books, and a sought-after retreat leader and speaker. With deep expertise in trauma and abuse, pastoral health, and guiding others through doubt and dark seasons of faith, he brings a wealth of wisdom to our conversation. He's also a minister of word and sacrament in the Reformed Church in America, having pastored congregations in Orlando and San Francisco before dedicating himself to training pastors and church leaders. In addition to his teaching, Chuck trains clergy on issues of abuse and trauma, conducts assessments for pastors and church planners, and consults on abusive investigations within church communities. Many of you know him from his widely acclaimed book, When Narcissism Comes to Church: Healing Your Community from Emotional and Spiritual Abuse. Today, I'm thrilled to dive into not only his book on narcissism, but also his upcoming book, Healing What's Within: Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Weary, Wounded, and Wandering, which is set to be published this October. So let's dive into a rich conversation with Chuck DeGroat, a leader in the field of spiritual and emotional healing. So tell us a bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up, and who had the biggest influence on you during your growing up years?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I grew up on Long Island, New York. So I spent my first 19 years on Long Island. And yeah, in terms of influences, I mean, it was a challenging time and probably too much to get into right now. But the big shift for me came when I went mid-sophomore year to Dordt College. And some people are going to say, did he just say dork? No, I didn't say dork. Dordt College, D-O-R-D-T. So I went from Long Island, New York, as this guy with a thick New York accent, to the Midwest, to Northwest Iowa, and to a school where I was introduced to all kinds of goodness, just in terms of the range of thinking, writing, and a broader Reformed tradition than the tradition I'd grown up in. And so that was a really formative time. I can't say that there was one particular influence, but I mean, I was taking classes back in the late 80s, I guess, early 90s, and in liberation theology and environmental ethics, and in Leslie Newbigin. I was exposed to Leslie Newbigin by a guy named Mike Goheen, who was doing his graduate studies on him, and David Bosch, and all these incredible writers. So this beautiful sort of missional theology, a more expansive Reformed theology. So that was a really important time. And just quickly after that, spent time in Chicago for 2 years, seminary in Orlando, Florida, and then pastoring in Orlando for 14 years, San Francisco for 5, and now we live in Grand Rapids, and I work in Holland, Michigan, and we've been here for the last 11 years.
Wow, you have really gone from coast to coast.
Yeah, that's right.
From one corner in Orlando all the way up to San Francisco.
We've hit it all, and the Midwest. So
yeah. Right. I mean, that's great. That's the great American journey right there.
That's right.
What tradition did you grow up in that was different than the Reformed tradition that you?
Yeah, I did grow up in the Reformed tradition. We bounced. We didn't know we were Reformed. My parents, in fact, took me to church to get baptized, and it kind of stuck. And we were at a Lutheran church, but then we found our way to East Islip Christian Reformed Church and walked in. And apparently, because our last name is DeGroat, they told us that we belong there. And so we were welcomed in, and then we were at that church for a few years. We were at a Reformed church in America for a few years, and then a little later I went out to college. Yeah, I was introduced at, I guess, at Dordt College to just much more expansive theology, just in the sense that of its engagement with God's creation and the beauty of God's creation, with a wider imagination for God's people. It was, yeah, a formative experience.
Yeah, when you mention environmental ethics and liberation theology, those are two topics I did not imagine Dordt College would be teaching back then.
Yeah,
So that fascinates me that they were kind of ahead of their time, so to speak.
they were. I mean, I often say, I mean, we were reading Ron Sider's, the book on being pro-life and all aspects of life back in, I think I read that in 1989. And so there was this sense even back then of, nowadays people are being challenged to think maybe a little bit more broadly about how faith and politics connects and things like that. Well, I
Mhm.
feel like that was a good college education for me, and I'm really grateful. I mean, I remember I was telling my daughters recently, we had a kind of a debate crew, and I was on the side of what would be called indigenous theology today, and so it's really kind of incredible to look back at that formative education.
Yeah, that's I just love that. That's amazing. It kind of to me it shows how um, as long as the college is using good books and has good professors, it's
Yeah.
okay if it's in the middle of the cornfields in Iowa.
Yeah, that's right.
You
That's
know,
right.
you don't have to be in some major city to get a good education.
Oh man. And for this Long Island boy, I mean, I was enamored by the vast expanse of the cornfields and the
Mm.
sky. I mean, I could actually see stars. Like, yeah, I couldn't see stars growing up. So,
Yeah.
it's like, wow, this is incredible. So I was enamored by the beauty and the simplicity of the culture too.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love it. I grew up in the cornfields of southwestern Ontario and then went to
Ah,
big cities. So I had the opposite
yeah,
experience, but I still like now at this stage in my life, I kind of have a my craving for the countryside grows. Like I'm like when I was 17, I was like, ah, get me out of here. But now it's like, oh, I want to go
yeah,
back to that farmland I
yeah,
grew up on. Yeah.
yeah. I love it.
So you've written books on church leadership, but specifically your book called When Narcissism Comes to Church, and
Yeah,
the subtitle is Healing Your Community from Emotional and Spiritual Abuse.
yeah,
I read this when it came out a few years ago, and it really struck me as an important book for our time that I think it's
mm,
not hard for Christians today or even non-Christians to look at the news and see stories of pastors, quote unquote, falling from grace. I mean, I
yeah,
just this last weekend I saw a piece from Christianity Today that was tracking a number of pastors that either were arrested for different crimes or involved in illicit affairs in the Dallas
yeah,
metro
yeah,
area. And I was so discouraged. I was like, what
yeah,
on earth is going on down
yeah,
there?
yeah, yeah,
But it's unfortunately more common than we want it to be that there are issues in church leadership where narcissism raises its ugly head. And
yeah.
I really think your book speaks to this. So I wonder, what inspired you to write a book on
Yeah.
narcissism within the church?
Yeah. Well, really, here again, it goes a long ways back for me. It goes back to the late 1990s. I'm in seminary. I get a dual degree, a Master of Divinity and a Master of Arts in Counseling. So I'm trained to be a therapist, and I'm beginning to listen to people's stories. And one of one of my early experiences is I'm sitting with women in particular who are experiencing some form of verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sometimes domestic violence in the home. And I'm looking for resources back then, and there wasn't a whole lot. In fact, I remember finding the first book I ever found on emotional abuse had been translated from the Dutch, and
Hmm.
so I'm scouring libraries for resources on these things, and there just wasn't a whole lot back then. One really interesting piece of it too, I mean, there have been leadership crises within I mean, scripture details leadership crises within, within the people of God, and of course church history as well. So that's not new, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, there were a number of televangelists that were exposed. But in my RCA, Reformed Church in America church on Long Island, there was a high profile, the first ever court TV case of an elder who had an affair with the organist and murdered his wife. And so, I mean, the scandal sort of visited my local Reformed church in America on Long Island. So, I sort of had some exposure to this. And I think over the years, as I was doing this work, both as a pastor and as a therapist, well, then, when Me Too comes around and Church Too comes, or things like that, it felt I had been doing some consulting with churches. I'd been doing pastoral assessments and pastor and church planner assessments for years. And it just felt sort of natural to put some of that into writing. And in some respects, I wrote it just out of years of doing the work. I mean, I did research obviously for it, but it sort of felt like a book that was in my body over the course of many years.
That's really helpful. So as you were doing all of these assessments with pastors, like give us a little, window into what that looks like.
Yeah.
Like, because I think for the average person, they don't know what a church planner assessment looks like. So when you
Yeah.
go to assess a new
Yeah.
church planner, what's the process? How do you begin to understand who that person is?
Yeah, so church planner assessments are a little bit different than maybe a psychological assessment for a pastor, in the sense that many, not all, but many church planner assessments involve a group of planters coming together for several days, maybe 3 to 5 days. There's some pre-testing that happens, but then there's some teaching, there's some role playing within that, there's some preaching, there are a number of things that happen. There are interviews that happen within that space that are important. Going back to when I first started doing this, I was always the one in the group that would sort of throw up the yellow flag, if not the red flag. And I almost, in fact, after the Narcissism book came out, someone called me, a guy I knew 25 years ago, and he said, "I remember when you used to be, this kid who was raising the yellow or red flag, and we kind of dismissed you because we thought, this guy's 30 years old. He doesn't know what the heck he's talking about, But I was always the one saying, I'm wondering a little bit about his interactions, or he comes off as a little cocky here, or the way he talked to his wife just seemed to me to be really condescending." And, the word often was, he's just a little rough around the edges. That's how these guys are. They tend to be kind of full of themselves, but they really do, good things for the kingdom. And what ended up happening was a number of the assessments that I've been a part of, I would hear later, and in fact, some pastors that I worked with, I'd hear later that that there was some sort of scandal, that it flamed out, that there's some sort of abuse situation. And I think that's probably, I hate to say that it took me that long to take it really seriously, but that's when I started raising my voice maybe a little louder and saying, "Hey, this is serious. When I raise a yellow flag, I mean it. And this is something that we need to talk about."
Yeah, it kind of goes to the point. Like, I think a lot of people, when they're interacting with people in church or people at work, people at school, they do get these moments like you had where you're like, wait, that's a little bit off base there. Like the way that person is talking to their spouse, that it's striking me as odd, and it seems like there's maybe something more going on.
Yeah.
But we are quick to dismiss this this impulse in us. So could you talk a little bit more about that impulse, and how do you cultivate the ability to trust that impulse, and and kind of where to go with it?
Yeah, I really, it's a good way of saying it. I have had to sort of cultivate an instinct within, a sort of to trust my gut. I think I dismissed that pretty early on in the face of older men in particular in these processes who would say, "Well, I've done this 100 times. We get guys like this all the time. That's just the way church planters are." And, I had to not just begin to bring my my psychological categories to it, but my theological categories as well.
Hmm.
But Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but became a servant, became nothing, right? There's that sense that we're called to be Christ-like. What does that mean for a pastor when I'm watching the exact opposite with some of these guys who are attention-seeking and grandiose and seem to be chasing after a platform, seem to be uninhibited when it comes to saying, this is the word of the Lord. That should,
Hmm.
I guess, inspire fear in us as we get up and we preach. But, they seem to be able to get up and with great certainty and confidence. Um, so I think it took a while for me to sort of cultivate that clear gut on these things and to be able to say something feels really off. I did experience some condescension when he spoke to his wife like that. I remember one quick story. There was a spouse that spoke up and said she didn't feel particularly supportive of this husband's call to church planting. And I was in a room with another assessor and I asked a couple of curious questions. I wanted to know why. And she talked about the significant disruptions to their family and the fundraising and some really normal things. And he was looking at her, just kind of shaking his head, like, what are you talking about? And, at some point along the way, says, I get the final vote. It's not your call anyway. And he laughs and the other assessor laughs. And I look at her and she doesn't have tears in her eyes, but she might as well have had tears in her eyes. She just looks scared.
Hmm.
And I think that there were times early on that I think this probably goes back to 2005, 2006, where I hesitated to say something. I might bring it up later on in a committee, but I think I became much better at in the moment saying, no, 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 this isn't right, and I'm also a therapist, so I've gotten used to being able to make those calls mid-therapy session too, but
Mhm.
just being able to have the confidence to say, no, 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 that was condescending, that was whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and it strikes me that this is not, even though this book is about the church and it's about pastors in particular, uh, narcissism, of course, isn't unique to pastors because,
No.
I think about that example of the husband basically, yeah, just outright saying
Yeah.
it's my call and ignoring his wife's questions, worries,
Hmm.
fears, apprehensions. And I've seen that not only in pastors,
Yeah.
I have seen it plenty, especially
Yeah.
when I was in seminary, Bible college. I would see it at
Yeah.
times come up, but I've also seen it in community members and people I know, where it's like when a couple together, when one of them, and it's usually the man in in most cases I can think of, begins to ignore his wife's um, honest worries and fears
Yeah.
and doesn't take them seriously. And I think it's, from what I can see, it's like it's that person doesn't see their marriage as a partnership.
Hmm.
It's much more kind of this patriarchal sort of
Yeah.
mindset.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of what was featured. Even in contexts that were more egalitarian, you'd see those dynamics as well. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, that became troubling. But I think we weren't naming these things quite as clearly back then. And it raised for me significant questions about how we assess church planters, and what we prize, in a church planter, just in terms of the kind of personality. I would hear assessors talk about we need an alpha male. We need a good fundraiser. We need someone bold and courageous and clear and nowadays I hear that I'm like, oh, that feels like a recipe for the kind of domineering, grandiose personality that I see in these contexts.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think those are the primary reasons. One, I did not pursue church planning. Because when I was young, I mean, yeah, I maybe like when I was like 18, 19, 20 in Bible college, I was at first interested in doing church planning.
Yeah.
But then the more I got to know it, the more I got to kind of see like who the kind of people were that became church planners. I just I was like, I don't think I have what it takes to do the job. And
Yeah,
so I was like, you know what? I think I'm built for more of a long-standing pastoral
yeah,
position.
yeah,
Um, and that's where God has brought me. So I'm happy in it. But it is interesting how we kind of have these ideas of what would make a great church planner. And often it's it seems like it's not the same. We don't think of it as the same as like what would make a good long-term pastor. Like we see those as two very different things.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's where things are starting to change. I mean,
Mm.
with I was so grateful when my book came out. There are a number of others that came out around the same time. Wade Mullins' work, Scott McKnight, Laura
Mhm.
Barringer, Diane Langberg, and in this world where it seems that we should be in competition with one another, there was very much this sense that God is up to something here, and the kinds of things that we see in scripture, frankly, particularly in the prophets, where God is, calling shepherds out on the way that they're ruling harshly and brutally, for instance, as Ezekiel says, and calling them to be different kinds of shepherds. I mean, we're doing that essentially again today, calling pastors back to the kind of humility that we long to see in women and men who lead us.
Hmm. Yeah. And I mean, that's such a good work. And I'm sure it's a long work because for many pastors, I guess I can only speak for myself. Like I grew up in an environment that was extremely patriarchal, that was, kind of built on having the strong man fight the fight, so to speak, and
Mm-hmm.
having to unlearn a lot of that has
Yes.
taken, I'm still unlearning it, and it takes a lot of time. And so yeah, this is really important work. So we might I probably should have asked this earlier, but what would be a working definition of narcissism, just for our listeners to kind of understand what we're dealing with here?
Yeah, well, I normally look at four things when we're talking about narcissism, and for people who read the book, I'm nuanced. So these are the four sort of basic categories of the DSM-5, which is sort of the Bible of the psychology world, right? So
Hmm.
grandiosity, attention seeking, entitlement, and lack of empathy are the four that we generally sort of look at. And I think probably all those are pretty self-explanatory. The one that people generally wonder about is lack of empathy. And that's pretty core to the definition that those who are narcissistic lack the capacity to sort of get into your world because they're so sort of tuned into their own inner world. They're living so self-protectively, really themselves. I mean, we can get into some of the psychological dynamics underneath the surface, but when we talk about narcissism, we sort of have to nuance because there are the more grandiose oriented kinds of narcissistic leaders. And then there are what we call the more vulnerable or covert narcissistic leaders. They don't necessarily want the big platform or the big pulpit, but they are just as entitled, just as self-aggrandizing. I mean, I tell this story, but I think of a story of a particularly small church in a rural pasture who operated with high certainty and actually counted it as God's favor that his church was much smaller than other churches. And so wasn't looking for the grand kind of platform, right, and the big numbers, but sort of from that place operated with the same kind of bullying and the same shaming and the same gaslighting, um, and and uh, and would go to denominational meetings and regional meetings and stuff like that and talk about how God's favor was on his church and not those other churches that had sold out to the world because he was sticking true to the gospel, and so there are different ways that narcissism shows up. I talk about 9 particular faces or masks or shapes of narcissism as well that really help nuance it because there are people, and in fact, this has been one of the big discoveries, I think, of the last probably 3-4 years since the book came out. The number of people who have called or written or corresponded who said, yeah, the narcissistic leader that I'm under wasn't grandiose and in fact came off as at first as pretty kind and pretty generous, and then we began to see some of the kinks in the armor, so to speak. We began to see the ways in which he had some sense that, if he gave you favors, he'd expect favors, or however it would show up. And so they'd say, it didn't show up as the kind of the bully. It showed up as more of the guy who was kind but expected favors and felt entitled because of his kindness. And when I talked to him about it, when we expected some accountability around that, he fought back or pushed back. And so this really deserves a lot of nuance, I guess, when we're talking about narcissism.
So when you describe that pastor as being kind and kind of using kindness as a weapon in a way, it made me think of the fight, flight, or fawn response to when we're reacting to trauma, when we're afraid. And I wonder, is that what's going on there? Like, is there a fawning that's happening from that kind of pastor?
I think that's exactly it, because we know that narcissism is really a trauma response at some level, particularly when it's escalated and becomes what we call personality disorder. It becomes a sort of fixed response or way of coping in the world. Oftentimes because those who are narcissistic experience some sort of pain, abuse, bullying, powerlessness. And so there's always a story behind it, which gives me great compassion for those I work with. But the kind of fawning response that you're talking about, a friend of mine coined the term the benevolent narcissist. It looks like the person who, who shows up appeasing, people pleasing, and kind and nice at the meetings, and seems a bit conflict avoidant. And yet there's a stickiness to that person. There's a quiet resentment that shows up when he doesn't feel like you're quite scratching his back like he scratched your back, and so on. And so what, as you rightly say, they're operating out of a response that is helping them survive in the world, but it's not really coming from a core of deep generosity, or what we might call the fruits of the spirit. It's coming more out of a place of deficiency and coping.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way to put it. Like it's it's easy for us to hate our enemy, and the narcissist, whoever the narcissist is in your life, is probably your enemy in some sense. You don't like being around that person. You don't want to be around that person. And granted, of course, there's the abusive narcissist that you need to get away from, of course. But there's a lot of people that we're on a spectrum of narcissism that we all experience it to some extent. And the way you're talking about it kind of helps me see the empathy, how to be empathetic towards a narcissist, in the sense of like, okay, what is it that this person is afraid of? What happened that they're hiding from, that they're protecting themselves from?
That's right. And there, in my experience, there are some who over time might let you into that by nature. This mask that they're wearing, this personality disorder, whatever language you want to use, this way of coping, is self-protective, it's defensive. And so they don't let you in very easily. But I mean, I've worked with men in particular. I remember sitting with a man, he's over on my couch over there, who was in his 60s, and we're talking about decades of harm. And his wife was with him as well. And I remember about 3 days into a 5-day intensive that I was doing with him, he looked at me and he said, "Why are you being so kind to me? When are you going to clobber me?" And I said to him, "Talk to me about being clobbered." And then the tears just start to come. And he said, "Oh man, I used to get clobbered. I used to get beat on." And we got back to the core of his story. It turns out, for years in ministry, it was like clobber or be clobbered, bully or be bullied. And that was a story he lived out of. And so, I don't know that you can do this work without compassion. Although I know a lot of folks out there who think, narcissists are irredeemable. They don't change. And I just disagree with that theologically, biblically, psychologically.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great segue. You have a new book coming out in October, and it's more uh it's obviously I haven't read it since it's not out yet, but this book, your first book was on narcissism, was about identifying the problem. That's what it struck me. You're identifying
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
using these nine faces of the narcissist.
yeah,
Um, but this book's called Healing What's Within, Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Weary, Wounded, and
yeah,
Wandering. I mean,
yeah.
that title is amazing in and of itself.
Mhm.
I feel like I immediately want to read something like that because I'm like, who cannot resonate with those three words, weary, wounded, and
Yeah,
wandering? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So say a little
Just
bit about
borrowing
this new
borrowing a
work.
little bit from that Come Ye Sinners hymn from way back in the day, right?
Mhm.
But people always hear a little Henry Nouwen in that title too, Coming Home to Yourself, to God. Yeah, yeah, the book, I didn't want to, after the Narcissism book came out, as you might imagine, because a lot of people were talking about this kind of stuff, there was that invitation from a couple of different publishers, like you've got to, what's the phrase? You got to strike when the iron is hot or something like that. I don't even know.
Yeah.
But you got to write a second book. You got to write a follow-up book. And you don't know me that well, but that's just not who I am. I did not want to do that. I wasn't interested in. People started calling me the narcissism guy, and I didn't want to be the narcissism guy. Um, but as I,
That's not a great nickname.
yeah, right. So I did think about the work that I've been doing over the years and how people heal. And, you just alluded to it. There are these trauma responses: fight, flight, fawn, find, freeze, fold, 6 Fs, four for the sympathetic nervous system, two for the parasympathetic dorsal system. That's all stuff that I get into in the book to some degree. But we're asking sort of what's the imprint of trauma within us? Abuse is what happens to you, but trauma is what happens within you. And how do we turn our attention to what happens within? Because the reality is that I think even after my book came out, but if you pay any attention to some of the stories out there, if you're on social media, a lot of people talking about what happened to them in situations where there is sometimes a lack of justice. We can't control a lot of what happens to us, but not attending to that imprint of the wound within. Trauma is really the Greek
Mm.
word for wound. And so now, how do we turn our attention to the wound, which is unique for each and every one of us? Two people can go through the same abusive event, but the traumatic wound looks very different for each one, depending on their story, their upbringing, their attachment style, their family, all the stuff. So now it's how do we attend to the wound within? And what we know is that trauma seems to fester in aloneness, which is to say, loneliness when we're not tended to, when we don't have people in our lives who look in on us and care for us. Trauma seems to grow in the face of a sense of powerlessness. There's nothing I can do about this, and overwhelm. And so how do we care for people well who experience this loneliness, this overwhelm, this powerlessness in the face of their wounds?
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, if we have a tendency, why, I guess my question is, why do we have a tendency to avoid looking at our wounds when
Yeah,
the hurt has been done?
yeah,
If I think of it as a physical cut, it's like the cut, you're bleeding,
yeah,
but
yeah,
normally we would put a band-aid on it, we'd get stitched up. But with
yeah,
emotional wounds, it's like
yeah,
everything in me just wants to avoid it.
yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we get used to, I mean, this is part of trauma. It's trauma at its core is disconnection from our emotions, from our bodies, from our sensations, from our gut intuition. And so we become disconnected. We pull away from the pain. And it's easy to do that. We get busy, we get addicted. I talk a lot about addiction in the book and how we cope in
Mm,
particular kinds of ways. And the reality is that we have to return to ourselves. Now, that's a phrase I use very intentionally, not just as a therapist, but that's a phrase from Saint Augustine, who talks about the nature of addiction. He says, "Lo, you were within, God, but I was on the outside searching for you there," which is to say, we become so externalized that we lose touch with what's happening within us. And, folks will say to me, well, turning inward, isn't that narcissistic? And I'll often say, well, no, narcissists lost touch with that inner conversation. They became externalized. They live in a coping style and a survival style that keeps them at a distance from themselves, from their core, from their needs, from their feelings, from their emotions, from their from their their clearest thoughts. And so the process of healing involves a deep reconnection with oneself, which I think leads to deep reconnection with God and connection with others. And what's sad is I think the narcissist, by definition, can't connect with himself, with God, and with others.
That's striking because I think you're right. We often think of the narcissist as someone who is obsessed with themselves,
Right.
but they've actually become so disconnected from themselves that they're
Yeah.
doing everything they can to kind of make themselves loud for some or make themselves likable.
Yeah.
But they're so disconnected. So what are some of the marks of a person who is connected to themselves, to
Yeah.
God, and to others, like to their story? Like, what does
Yeah.
that look like?
It begins with curiosity. And this is where I can't believe you haven't read the book yet, even though it's not out. Yeah, no.
I know. What is wrong with me?
I know.
Seriously.
There are three guiding questions in the book, and they're the three questions that God asks in Genesis chapter 3. And my contention is they're really compassionate and curious questions. Where are you? Who told you? So where are you gets at your state, how you're hiding, your style of coping, who told you, which gets a bit more at the story. And then have you eaten from the tree, which is to say, where have you taken your hunger and thirst, which gets to what's most deeply stirring within you. And I find those to be really anchoring questions. They're questions that invite us to see that God is the first curious figure in our life, that God wants to move toward us. So I'm hoping that this is a book that allows for some redemption in people's connection to God, because particularly with spiritual abuse, God, it feels like God is 1,000 miles away. God's responsible. So I want people to begin to see that God is curious about them, but then we can turn our attention with curiosity to what's going on within. So where are you? Like, how are you hiding? What's your particular constellation of fig leaves that you've sown? How are you coping? How are you surviving? Part two, who told you? So what's the story behind what's happening within you? And let's begin to tell that story and get more curious about that. And then the third section that really gets at our addictive tendencies, the ways in which we disconnect and cover over, but how those very things can actually allure us back to God. That as we pay attention to the depth of our desires, we find ourselves moving toward God. So it's really it ends with a invitation to get connected to your most deep longings within.
That's really beautiful. What do you suggest for the average Christian? They may not, maybe they're in a place where they aren't ready to go see a professional therapist.
Yeah.
But like in a church community, how can we foster some of this curiosity about one's story and connecting with what's really going on with ourselves?
Yeah, this is, I feel like, a really important question, because not everyone can go to therapy, afford therapy, wants to go to therapy, likes therapy, but we can cultivate spaces within our churches that are honest, that have the potential for some vulnerability. I mean, having been a pastor, what I found at times is that the spaces that we sit in at times can be spaces in which we avoid. We can minimize, we can joke, we can intellectualize. We keep books in front of us. We stay at a distance from one another. But we know that trauma dissipates in the face of connection, when we bear witness to one another, when we share our story with another who responds with kind eyes and a listening ear and a sense of presence. That's what's important. And by the way, as a therapist, as a pastor, that's the most important part of the work that we do.
Mm.
We can't get too lost in words or in fixes. A lot of what we bring is our attunement, our attention to others. That's what we long for. And so if we can create spaces where people feel seen and heard, that seems to me to be really, really important.
Yeah, I gotta believe that if you feel seen and heard by those around you in your church, in your family, then you might begin to feel seen and heard by God as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I think that the hope is, I talk about that phenomenon that St. John of the Cross named as the dark night of the soul. God, the reality of the dark night and our dark nights in these times where it feels like God is 1,000 miles away, as St. John of the Cross says, that God is near. St. Augustine says, God is more near to you than you are to yourself. God doesn't go away. It's we who go away. And so it's really important for us to, as we return, to attune to the one who's always attuned to us. And that's the beautiful thing. Like I'll sit with people because I'm a spiritual director as well. And a lot of this work sort of blends together, right? I'll sit with people who are like, oh, I've always felt like I had to climb the ladder to God, or I had to do the thing, or I had to clean myself up. I didn't realize that God was attuning to me, pursuing me all the while, and particularly people with abuse stories. I mean, I've worked with people who've been sexually abused at a very early age, who find some comfort in the reality that God is their deepest reality, not abuse, not addiction, not their disordered strategies, but God's kindness, God's curiosity, God's presence, the image of God within them. That can be really reorienting and refreshing for folks.
Mm. Do you think there's a connection between what we were talking about earlier about how we kind of avoid our emotional wounds and the sense that we avoid God as well, even though he's what we need. He's what
Yeah.
it brings such healing, but we
Yeah.
tend to avoid both these
Yes.
things.
I think
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah, I think in general, when we live in a disconnected state, which is to say, when we pull into self-protection and disconnection, our autonomic nervous system's in a place of survival, by definition, we lose connection, and we become distanced from God. Now, there are 1,000 things we do to sort of that seem like connection with God, and we've got our books and we've got our worship songs and all the things, but most people will report that they don't have a kind of experiential connection with God, and they discover that later. So yeah, it's just really important that we begin that retuning, that reconnecting work, that reconnecting process wherever you are. You don't necessarily need to find your way to therapy to begin to do that, to sit with a friend and to move toward vulnerability, to begin to hear God whispering to you, where are you? And to know that God's heart behind that is really kind.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to end our conversation. Um, this idea that God is kind to us. And I love that you're using that passage from Genesis 3, because that has always struck me as like that's the beginning of the gospel in so many ways, like where
Yeah.
instead of God bringing condemnation or judgment
Yeah.
upon Adam and Eve, his
Yeah.
first question is, where are you?
Yeah.
And that is the question of someone who loves you. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
someone who cares more about who you are than what you did,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good.
Well, Chuck, thank you for being on the show today. Really
Yeah.
appreciate this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Travis. It's good getting to know you a little bit.
Yeah, and when your book comes out, I'll be sure to get a copy of it, and hopefully we can have you back on the show in another season.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. As we wrap up this conversation with Chuck DeGroat, we've explored some profound themes around narcissism, the importance of getting curious about our own stories, and the path to finding true healing. Chuck reminded us that understanding the deep wounds within us is the first step toward healing, both individually and within our communities. We also talked about how, in the midst of this journey, it's essential to look to Jesus, the one who meets us in our brokenness and leads us towards restoration. I hope this conversation has encouraged you to reflect on your own story, embrace vulnerability, and seek healing, trusting that Jesus walks with us every step of the way. As I've heard it put before, God is closer to us than our very breath. So my prayer for you today is that you would know the God who is near, know the God who is within, and know the God who surrounds you. Until next time, take good care.